Hi, everybody. My name is Dan. I am the Senior Developer Relations Manager here at Cerbos, and I am very happy that you were able to join us today to talk about some really interesting stuff, to learn some things together, to exchange with us, and hopefully to grow professionally and have a little fun along the way. We're going to give just another minute or two. As always, it's a good thing to allow people a little bit of extra time to come on through. So if you'll just bear with us, we'll get started in, well, what do you want to say about Alex? About 60 seconds,
About
Alex?
that. Won't put a
About
countdown clock
60
on it.
seconds. That sounds great. While we're waiting for those 60 seconds, we'll give everybody a moment to file in, pretend there's a door and one person can fit in at a time. If you'd like to say hello in the chat, it's always fun to see who's there, fun to see where you're from, because of course, people can be joining from absolutely anywhere. We see, hi, hello, someone joined from Edinburgh. So cool. I've never been. I would like to go. I understand it rains a fair amount.
Not much better down here in London, to be honest.
Hello from Swindon. Nice. Excellent. I don't know where that is, but you know what? So happy that you could join us. Thank you so much.
Where are you, Dan? We haven't
Where am I
specified
then?
that.
I am based in Paris, France. Despite my accent, I've worked extremely hard to gain sort of a generic North American sounding accent. I am French. I live here in Paris. We are having a sunny day today. It's the first sun we've seen since March. So good for us.
Well, I'm in London and we're about to kick off a bit of a mini heat wave here, so it's going to be disgustingly warm.
Very good. Ivan, are there any sharks in Paris today? Well, I mean, hopefully not. I hope we've dealt with that issue in time for the Olympics, but thank you. That's a pertinent question. I appreciate it. All right. Well, it's good to see everybody in the chat. It's good that we've got a bit of liveliness here already today. I really, really appreciate that strong, good energy going into it today. So once again, my name is Dan. I am the Cerbos Senior Developer Relations Manager. I'm actually also very new to the Cerbos team. This is what, my third week, Alex?
Yeah, about that.
Yeah, about that. So
Feels like been here forever.
So much has happened in the past 3 weeks. And like you on the call today, there's a good chance that I'm going to be learning some things with you along the way. So with that, ask questions. I'm going to be asking questions. I would like you to ask questions too. And that way we can all learn together, we can all grow together, and hopefully by the end of this, we'll have a much better idea about how to do our jobs and about how to implement, well, what are we going to be implementing? We'll get to that in a moment. But first, Alex, why don't you introduce yourselves to the audience?
Yeah, hi everyone. Thanks for joining. I am Alex Olivier, one of the co-founders and chief product officer here at Cerbos. I am an engineer at heart, but now spend my days working on solving a problem that I had to solve many, many times in previous lives, which is authorization roles and permissions. So we're going to go through today kind of from a practitioner level and from a business side of things, what authorization is and kind of what a better approach to it is that saves a lot of headaches. And then I'll show you, we'll actually both be sharing some war stories from our pasts around this and a solution to hopefully all your problems down the lines.
Absolutely. And like Alex, I'm also an engineer at heart and also an engineer by trade. I do still do engineering work despite the developer relations name. I'm a long-time open source developer and advocate, and I'm just really just happy to have an opportunity to, as I said, learn and also share some fun stories along the way.
Excellent. So I'm going to kick it off here with our talk today was about kind of the business case of externalized authorization. And I'm really going to start off telling you what my nightmare used to be. So as I said, I've kind of approached this from both a developer and more of a product management sort of practitioner perspective. Previous roles, I've been working in numerous startups, lots of B2B. I actually started my career way back at Microsoft doing sort of technical consulting in this area as well. And what my nightmare used to be in every one of those companies I worked on is we had this platform, we're in kind of earlier stage. We got, a few dozen, 100 customers at that stage of various different sizes. And then we got to the point where we kind of got to play in the big leagues and we started signing our first enterprise customers. And enterprise is a very loaded term. But my particular horror story, I guess you could say, it was when I was working for one particular system. In our platform, we had different user roles, and we just had 3 different user roles at that point. We had sort of an admin, a viewer, and a publisher. It was like a content management type system. And one day, down there, we're doing like our weekly sort of all hands, and the sales team stands up and says, "Great, we've just won these 2 massive deals. One was a massive airline in the Middle East. The other one was a office supply retailer in the US. You can probably guess both of those. And And whilst everyone's like cheering and applauding and ringing the bell, I'm sitting there going, this is going to be a nightmare. And the particular reason for that is having worked with numerous of these businesses over the years, banks, the health service here in the UK, numerous other things, you get a bit of a feel for what these organizational complexities are inside of these businesses. So in the case of both of those deals we just signed, we started going through the onboarding, got the customer success team set up, started ramping them up onto the system, and then really rightly turned around and said to us as an organization at the time, it's like, we have 50,000 employees, or each company there had 50, 60,000 employees each, and you're asking us to shoehorn them into 3 roles inside of your system. We have governance processes, identity systems, a whole team that manage IAMs like business. That is not going to be work. That's not going to be successful. That's not going to be acceptable. And when you start looking at these kind of bigger companies, you realize fairly obviously they're divided up into divisions. It might be regions, might be departments, might be verticals, might be XYZ things. So for an airline, they were broken up by different regions of the world and then countries within those regions. For the case of the office supply retailer in the US, they're broken up by regions of the US, and then departments within it. Like one looked after paper, one looked after staples, one looked after XYZ to some degree. And then within that, you have like the marketing team, the product team, the merchandising team, and they all needed different access, where your access and your permissions depended where you lived inside of the organization. So there I am as the product person, and I'm going, well, we're going to have to completely rebuild how we do permissions inside of our platform at the time. And this happened for every time we won an enterprise customer, and it led to a massive amount of churn and engineering time. In one case, for one of the previous companies I worked with before then, I ended up having to rebuild essentially the authorization, the permissions layer 3 times in the space of a year, because the requirements just kept changing for what the access controls were. And something like authorization is so core to the foundations of the system that it needs to be done right, it needs to be done flexibly, and it needs to be done in a way that will scale, not from a technical standpoint, but also from the business requirements. So my nightmare was winning these big deals because we had to then suddenly onboard all these disparate hierarchies and roles and permission sets inside of a system that really wasn't designed for it at the time, and there wasn't an off-the-shelf solution we could put in to solve that. So Dan, I guess from your experience having joined us fairly recently, you've worked in numerous of these organizations. Like, how much time have you seen wasted in maintaining the authorization?
Well, my bread and butter is system administration, right? So, everything from the old school days of loading up Linux and compiling kernels through to today. And the reality is that authorization's been a topic forever, right? The second you're logging into a machine, great identity, but now what, right?
Yes.
Everything from, chmod through to, user groups and so on and so forth, right? Like authorization plays into everything. If I had to pick like a horror story, I guess I worked for a AAA video game company for a while. No names, not going to shame anyone, but I worked for a AAA video game company for a while. And this was around the era when things like episodic content and DLC and releasing new maps and releasing new items into games was I don't want to say it was new, but it was really becoming the thing, right?
Mm.
And there was a particular AAA title. It was an online game with the shooty and the looty, and they were, of course, releasing content into the game. The developers released content in the game, and it's sometimes paid content. So it could have been anything from a complete new DLC package. It could have been just a new map. It could have been new items in the game, new skins for items in the game. And this is all well and good, and people are paying real world money for this. And lo and behold, AAA video games, right? Except that all of the logic for all of that was hard coded into the video game itself. It's hard coded into the logic of the video game. It was hard coded into the ways that the video game was polling for resources, was trying to determine what was accessible to it and not, which meant that every time somebody within the organization, read marketing or revenue, perhaps more properly stated, said, well, we need to release a new skin or we need to release a new, a new item. There was a small team of people that had to then enter into the system and go through the spaghetti code to figure out who gets access to what based on like what regions this item is available in, what promo codes it's associated with. Did they pay for it or not? Is it a timed item? Is it a timed item for that region, but not a timed item for that region? The amount of parameters around any single thing, like a skin on an item, was out of control. And it became quickly apparent that, one, it made a lot of money, but two, you needed a team of people to manage it. And that's untenable in the long run. And that is fundamentally an authorization problem.
Absolutely,
right?
and you put it exactly right by calling it spaghetti code. Like that really is what it does come down to, and the logic is kind of baked into the application layer side of things. So, but we hear many stories just like you heard from down there across our users and our customers. And with Cerbos, thankfully, we got to work with some massive brands over the years, and we've heard all the pains and all the edge cases and all the idiosyncrasies that need to be dealt with to handle different permissions and access models inside of the system. So what we're going to go through over the next 30 minutes or so is kind of the common themes and learnings that we've seen across our user base to handle and make sure authorization is set up properly and scalably inside of the business. So firstly, just to frame it, sort of what we term as like the traditional approach to authorization is very similar to what kind of Dan just explained. This is where you've really tightly coupled the authorization logic. And just to be clear, authorization is the rules that say, can this user do this action on this particular thing? So can this person view a particular loot, let's say, in a video game case? And that logic is hard coded into the application code. It's written once by some engineer who's answering a ticket, filling in answering a Jira ticket. It's shipped, and there's no clear owner at that point. We see this a lot for users that are coming to look at Cerbos as a solution to it, because really what this leads to is this fragmentation of policies and authorization logic across different parts of your code base. And use code bases can be massively sprawling. We work with one user here in the UK. They have 4,500 microservices, which their authorization logic used to be spread over. So whenever there was that change that comes through, they would have to go and touch potentially every single one of those systems inside of their stack and all the change process, etc., to go and get those updates deployed for just changing whether a particular user group or role can access a particular thing. The other aspect to look at is around that kind of that scalability and state management challenges. So when we think of scalability, it's on two vectors. There's the sort of business process scalability. So adding more roles, what's the churn involved, what's the process involved inside of the business to actually get a new role or definition defined inside of the system. And then from a technical standpoint is how can we technically go and update the code and logic across all the application code base and make sure that the application has all the data it needs to make a decision. That state management piece comes into it when you look at this approach. And if we look at the kind of straw man architecture-esque diagram here at the bottom, generally you'll have some end user application. It could be that game that Dan was talking about. It could be a mobile app. It could be your web app. It could be some device. That device is going to make API calls to your infrastructure. So it's going to go through some sort of gateway. That gateway system might be doing some high-level checks to make sure that user is authenticated. So there's going to be some checks to your identity provider, or your IDP, to validate a token or authenticate for someone. Eventually, that request will hit down into a requesting service. And that requesting service will then go and try and fetch the data or mutate the data based on what that request is kind of do. But actually, that requesting service might not be talking to the data directly. It might be talking to some other downstream service. So you have these like back-end microservices. So ABC is this diagram. And then those will be talking to the underlying database or cloud service or other kind of API it's talking to. And
what these suggesting that it's microservices all the way down?
Microservices and turtles all the way down. Yes. And what all these colored dots kind of represent is where the authorization logic sits when you kind of go with this scattergun approach where the logic is in different sorts of layers. So one small change on the logic inside of your database somewhere might actually have major upstream ramifications without you realizing it because this logic is so spread out. And this ultimately is the challenge of authorization and doing authorization in a scalable, performant, and also manageable way. And that sort of could do with some updating, let's say. So when we start thinking through like the sources of authorization maintenance, there's kind of this churn work, looking at different ways to look at it ultimately falls really into people, process, and technology. The typical pillars you'll see in probably any consulting slide these days, but really for something so core and cross-cutting as authorization, the frame does actually work really quite well. So we look at the people side of things, like who really defines the requirements of authorization. And when we first started Cerbos, we just thought, right, let's go and talk to developers. They're the ones that have to write the hard-coded if-else case switch spaghetti code inside the application. Surely they know what the requirements are. And boy, did we learn quickly that ain't necessarily the case, and really should have known given we've all done this ourselves in previous businesses. But it really falls into different buckets. Primarily, you have like your product engineering team. This is probably your most obvious authorization logic for requirements. So the product team or the engineering team is defining, okay, who should be able to access this record? Is this user part of the tenant this record belongs to? What package has this product, this user purchased? What does that give access to? Sort of entitlements, access control side of things. But once you start actually broadening the scope a bit, you start going to other departments. So customer support teams is one that's a bit of an afterthought sometimes. But really, if you're imagining you're on help desk, you got some customer phoning in saying, I'm trying to do something with my account. I can't access. I'm getting an error. I don't have permissions. So now you need to have this framework inside your permissions to allow a customer support team to actually go and get access to a customer's account and see what's going on. So you need this kind of like delegated admin, pseudo admin type role to see into things. There's a whole a whole group of permissions you need kind of around that to make sure your internal teams can access maybe end user accounts in a limited and controlled and audited way.
That's important, that point there, right? The limited and controlled way. We can certainly find examples in any sort of regulated environment of the principles of least trust and so forth. But even when we're thinking about GDPR requirements,
Absolutely.
Right there, you have to start thinking about, well, there has to be internal controls on who's going to have access to what. There can't just be an admin user.
Yeah, absolutely. We work a lot with a company here in the UK that does like utilities or public sector business, and they have that kind of support desk function. But your typical support agent can't see the billing information on an account. You need to have an escalated permission to be able to access that. And so they needed a framework to kind of define on that. And kind of this is the big bucket of customer support requirements come in. Going more into like this sales side of things, which is one that you maybe not think about, but this is another one of my headaches you could say from previous lives, which is we built the system, we got these permissions in place, we've given access and entitlements based on what products someone purchased to use our system. And then 6 months later, the sales team turns around and said, right, we want to change our product packaging. We want to sell our product in a slightly different way because we think there's more profit in it, or it's positioned to the market better, or it's a verticalized solution that only gives access to a subset of features. So now you have this other dimension of, okay, this person only be able to access it based on which variant or which version of the product packaging someone's comes on, has purchased to use that side of the system. So you need to start layering around these different entitlement sort of matrices based on what package someone has inside of the system. The sales one as well is kind of a driver and ties very much into maybe the regulatory side of things as well. But if you look at security particularly, this is maybe the most obvious. Once you start scaling up, once you go to kind of bigger regions or sales market, maybe you start selling into the US if you're based in Europe, let's say, security and having your best practices in place. You mentioned GDPR earlier, it is kind of a key one around this, and it very much falls into the space of really understanding and knowing exactly what's going on inside of your system, and not just knowing, but also being able to prove it. So I've gone through ISO 27001 and SOC 2 certifications in previous businesses. And unfortunately, I was the one that got dragged down to a dark, dingy conference room every year by an auditor and had to demonstrate the exact access controls that are implemented in our system. And if you don't have a stable system in place, these requirements of demonstrating your access controls being enforced and audited is really painful. And I was sitting there like grepping through S3 logs at one point, which was not a good look, I'll admit.
Nobody wants that. That's awful.
Definitely not. Now, the end user is kind of the next bucket, which sometimes maybe gets forgotten, but the end user, they have a job to be done, particularly if you're doing B2B sort of SaaS type solutions. You have a user, their business has bought your software, they should be able to get their job done in an efficient, timely manner because they have other roles and responsibilities and targets they hit. So really making sure that your end user has the permissions that they need, but also to be able to set up the permissions for their teams to go and define the roles and permissions and controls that they need to enable the rest of their team and their department to access things. And then you get this really kind of intricate webs of hierarchies going back to kind of the airline and the office supply retailer story. They have these very niche hierarchies and overrides they needed in order to support permissions at each level of that tree and each side of that department. And finally, probably the most obvious one is kind of regulatory. And this kind of falls into those two forms. Obviously, SOC 2, ISO are one thing, but the other interesting one is around data protection. So those of you that were building tech, sorry, nearly coming up to 10 years ago now, might be aware of the day the Safe Harbor Agreement fell through. So the Safe Harbor Agreement was a data sharing agreement between Europe and the US, and through various different reasons that got nullified at one point, which meant every company that was storing data about EU citizens in the US or vice versa suddenly needs to basically bifurcate their entire technology stack and localize the data in the relevant region for those users. Now, dividing database in half and splitting it into two different parts of the world, yeah, it's a pain, but it's doable. But the more important thing now is actually also ensuring that access controls and permissions are in place to make sure an EU employee who's trying to access that data is in the right region or vice versa. So someone in Europe should never be able to query data in the US or vice versa, depending on how you as a business has set up your regulatory stance. And this is an environment that's ever changing. So nowadays you have all sorts of data locality rules. The California Consumer Privacy Act is one of those. There's a number coming through Europe at the moment. Privacy Shield is kind of the replacement to some degree of Safe Harbor on top of GDPR. But this is a fully dynamic and changing world, and this is one that you have to be responsive to the requirements of, and the requirements that you don't really have control of unless you are out there lobbying the regulators. These requirements will land on your desk, and you'll have a timeline to go and implement them. So you have a lot of places requirements coming from authorization.
So speaking of thinking about requirements, and as you said, there's a ton of them. We haven't even started talking about how each German state's slightly different, right? Lisa actually had a really good question along these lines, and it's about defining requirements. Does it happen only during the MVP or development stage, or can this happen for mature products as well?
Life would be so much easier if it was only to be implemented once during the development stage. The reality is the world changes around you, and that world could be both other parts of the business you're in, but also macro factors like these global regulators that are putting in demands. So setting up your rules during development kind of lets you get the foundations right, but you will always be revisiting your authorization logic either directly or indirectly as your business and as your products evolve. So making sure you have a sensible framework and process around it to handle those evolutions is really key, and we'll be coming on to kind of a solution for that exactly. So we talk about people. Let's go on to process. So you've got these wonderful set of requirements that seem to be never ending, and they just keep coming in left, right, and center potentially. But when you start looking at kind of the authorization sort of ball of mud or problem, as it were, around the process side of things, it really falls into a few different buckets. First is policy authoring. So once you've got the requirements, how do you actually turn that into logic that's enforced into the application? So if your logic is hard-coded into your application, you're now going to have to go to the dev team who might say, take a ticket, we'll have a look in 6 months, depending on how agile you are as a business. Or in the case you maybe use some off-the-shelf third-party software, you're going to have to go back to them and say, could you maybe add this capability? Or maybe your hands are tied. So what is that authoring and updating process? Then once you start making updates, how do you go about testing those changes? How do you make sure that for all the edge cases that you may or may not have thought of, that change, that policy update is not only matching what the business is asking, but also hasn't broken any pre-existing controls that maybe shouldn't have been broken. So what is the testing story about it? After testing, how do you go about rolling out those changes? So as a responsible product organization, as I'm sure you all are, you will have blue-green deploys, you'll have staging, dev, etc., to make sure things are tested and have full test suite coverage. But what is that rollout story? How do you version your authorization logic inside of the application? And then to complete the circle, once the change has gone out, how do you know that that change is actually firstly working, and also how do you understand what's happening? So now you've done the checks, how do you create that audit trail of exactly at this time, did this person, or what did this person do to what resource and what action, and what was the effect? Was that allowed or denied? So getting those audit logs in place is not only useful from like a debugging experience, but it's also, again, a key requirement from some of these global regulations that businesses are now starting to subscribe to, ISO 27001, SOC 2, etc., and making sure your systems are architected in a way that you can answer those questions. So that from your kind of experience, what was that rollout maybe of those loot updates or DLC updates, and how have you seen kind of that work?
Right. Well, a wise person, speaking of environments, right? A wise person once said that everybody has a testing environment, and if you're very lucky, you might have a production one. So the reality is stuff's going to roll out to production, right? That's going to happen, and no amount of testing is going to catch every single bug, especially in microservices, especially in systems with emergent behaviors where it's impossible to know what's going to happen until it happens. I know that sounds trite, but that's the case, right? And so it's important you have a whole observability story and everything that needs to be done there, but you need to be able to put guardrails on things. That's really the big story here, right? Is that at some point there's going to be a chemical spill, but hopefully you have the mechanisms in place to prevent that spill from causing a lot of damage. And I choose ChemSpill, by the way, very specifically because I worked for a company that makes a web browser. Starting to get awfully specific here. And this was our internal term for when we had a really bad bug go out to production, i.e. people had, a release web browser running on their computers that was exploitable. It didn't happen very often, but it happened, right? And, in situations like that, having to walk the dog back to figure out what happened and why it happened and where it came from and so on and so forth was really difficult, right?
Yeah, and it's not just the kind of the rollout and rollback, but it's also understanding who was impacted by that. So that's where the audit piece comes in.
That's precisely it, right? Because it's one thing to figure out, like, okay, why did it happen? But then it's also to figure out, okay, but who's affected by it, right? And this idea of segmentation and regionalization and having that audit trail come back to you, all the way from the point of the developer's machine that pushed the code and to a binary got built and the binary got downloaded and installed on somebody's computer. That's about the largest logistics chain describable by humanity.
Certainly, especially at that scale.
Especially at that scale. Exactly. And this is the sort of environment where I wish we had strong policies around who had access to what and a strong auditing story for who or what accessed what, because in these ways it's not necessarily even people, it's machines accessing machines accessing machines, right? And the bug could have been introduced at any point in there. It could have been accidental, it could have been intentional, it could have been emergent, and that's where having that strong, those guardrails is important, and that strong policy and auditing story just would have been crucial, and it would be crucial today.
Yeah, absolutely. And we spoke about like the people, the process side of things. That really is the bulk of what you need to worry about when it comes to authorization. Because the final thing is technology. And actually nowadays, this is kind of a sole problem for those that want to invest in it. And we're going to go through kind of what that looks like. But really the questions you got to ask from a technology perspective is like, where do I need to do authorization? Is it on my front end? Is it on my back end? Is there some edge case? Is there some batch process we need to authorize? Is some async queue doing some things over here somewhere? Really understanding kind of, I need to be able to have authorization everywhere across my stack if this is going to work. From a deployability and scalability point of view, does this fit into my architecture? Many of you that are tuned in are probably wearing more of that architect hat or security analyst type hat, where you're trying to figure out, okay, well, where does this fit in my stack? If my authorization logic split everywhere, my authorization checks need to be everywhere. The state management side of things as well, like what do I keep inside of my IDP, my identity provider, in terms of like roles, groups, and hierarchies versus what needs to be down at the application level and what needs to be synchronized where, if at all. And then from an integration point of view, where does this plug in? So I now know this is a piece that needs to be in my stack, but which part of the system do I need to go and plug it into if it's not hard-coded? These are all kind of different technology challenges, which if you don't have a standardized solution, become a decision you need to make across every one of the different parts of your architecture.
Well, even if you do have a standardized solution, it's still a decision to make, right?
Indeed.
Because there's implementation details, and you think of once the technology has been implemented, then there's going to be segmentation questions. You may have a particular resource that is air gapped or in some way resource restricted.
Yeah.
And that's going to have a different way of making an authorization check, even if ultimately what's being checked against is the same across the board. It doesn't just end with these initial decisions, right? It's an ongoing maintenance situation that there's no one size fits all.
Yeah, but you're always going to have that kind of update sort of problem to solve. Like, how do you go and push updates to an air-gapped environment? Like you said, is really a key one, particularly when you're updating, say, something as a core as authorization. So we've given you lots of headaches, and hopefully you haven't given too many of you PTSD from lived experiences or maybe future problems that might be heading your way, and you now have that kind of deer in the headlights look. I've certainly been there. So what is the solution? What is the answer to all this? And the answer to this is externalized authorization. This is not a term we as Cerbos come up with. This is actually something that was defined and standardized by a few different industry bodies. NIST, the National Institute of Science and Technology in the US, was the first one really to define it. But there's even been white papers published now by the DoD and the White House in the US as well around kind of this is the ways things should be done. So what does externalized authorization actually mean? So everything we talked about really was about the kind of the requirements, and then you had to kind of take those requirements and kind of some bespoke solution that meet those requirements, and off you go. What externalized authorization has done is it's kind of taken this sort of ball of mud concept and standardized it into a few different interfaces and a few different ways of architecting your system. And what this ultimately means is it turns your decision making from requirements led to actually technology enabled. So before, you were having to come up with requirements and then go and build some bespoke bit of software that would go, or bespoke bit of spaghetti code, if we're honest here, and to go and implement those requirements. Externalized authorization is an approach which switches that model around, where you have this very powerful, versatile engine and you're feeding the requirements into it, and you don't have to go and change the underlying engine. You're really enabling much more complex requirements by putting in and standardizing around externalized auth than actually going hard coding it yourself. And really, the technology is now caught up with what these complex organizational requirements have been.
So that's actually been in many ways, the blocker, right? Why did we write it ourselves for so long? It's when there wasn't a standard.
Exactly.
Just wasn't, right? And then even when there were early standards, the reality of the matter is that they were not complex enough to deal with the actual technical or social or business systems that we work in on a daily basis, right?
Yeah, exactly that. And because everything was hard coded, no one had to reinvent the wheel every time. Everything was quite brittle and also very specific to individual implementations. And one team would go and code this and they'll get disbanded, and then you have to go and change the logic, and you're going to find someone that remembers how this thing works if they're lucky enough to still be someone inside of the business. So externalized authorization solves that both from a business process, a technology, and also the people side of things as well, as we'll go through. But firstly, to give you an idea of what this actually looks like in practice and kind of, again, fit that boxing architecture diagram, we've got that exact same flow we saw before. So client app sends a request to the API gateway. That gateway maybe go and check some permission from an IDP. Your requesting service handles that request, does some checks, maybe calls out some underlying service, then hits the database. What's changed now is we've taken all those authorization checks and centralized them into an external service that sits alongside of your system. So this orange box that says policy decision point at the bottom here, this is where all your authorization checks have done. And every part of the application stack is calling into one of these policy decision points to make the check. What that ultimately means is all that authorization logic code is now no longer inside of each of your application sort of blocks in this diagram. It is now centralized in a single place, and which means a few different things. Firstly, there's a single source of truth of exactly what's allowed to be done. Secondly, every part of your system can go and check permissions from regardless of where in your architecture that system is and get back a consistent answer. And thirdly, it's a central administration point to actually understand what's going on and what your logic should be. So architecturally, what this means is you have a central store of what your policies are, this policy store in the diagram here. And this is your de facto, right, these are the business rules for the different types of resources and actions inside my system, and under which condition those actions should be allowed. Could be as very simple as this person must have a role, or could be very fine-grained as this person must have one of 3 roles, and they must be the owner of the resource, and they must be part of this group, et cetera, et cetera. And those policies are defined in some sort of way that isn't application code. It's a definition of your business rules and something that's a bit more human readable than application code. And it doesn't require someone in the customer support team to go and be an expert in Java, or someone to be in the customer team to really understand Go, let's say. And on top of that policy store, there's some sort of administration point. And one of the sort of side effects and side benefits of this architecture is because all your decisions are going through a centralized decision point, there's a central point to create that audit log as well. So now, regardless of where your permission checks are happening across your architecture, you now no longer need to hard code that spaghetti if else statement. You also don't need to worry about writing the audit logs of what actually happened, because there's a decision point that's getting that check. Can this subject do this action on this resource? It makes a decision. It can then create an output, a policy decision audit log saying, at this time, this subject tried to do this action on this resource. It was allowed to deny by this particular policy for this particular version. That is your indelible log of exactly what happened and what permission checks were done inside of the system, which keeps all the auditors happy and also massively helps with the debugging side of things. So this architecture also gives you sort of a few different benefits. It centralizes the administration. So now, whenever you want to go and manage or change or evolve your authorization logic, there's a central place you do it. There's a single source of truth that is version controlled. With Cerbos, we actually tell users to go and use a GitHub repo. Your development teams are already used to that workflow in terms of versioning, testing, checking. That policy store could be something that's auditable, and you most likely already have governance processes in place to manage that workflow and that change workflow, and centralizing it. And then what this policy decision point architecture also then gives you is allows you to actually distribute the decision making. So whilst before we had a single sort of decision point on the stack, in reality, what you can now do is because you decoupled the administration from the actual decisions, you can have centralized administration and distributed decisions. And so you can actually push the decisioning logic close to the application or close to the service that it needs to. So from a performance perspective, you're going to have very, very snappy response. And when you're looking at things like not wanting to have a single point of failure, wanting high availability, those kind of things, because every decision is being made local to every requesting service, you're not going to have that bottleneck. Every service can make its own individual decisions, but they're managed centrally from this policy administration sort of part of your architecture.
And that actually speaks directly to a question we got from Ivan. Mentions pros and cons. Single point of failure, single point of vulnerability, along with this whole idea of a single point of administration. You were going down that path. Why don't we develop it a little bit further, Alex?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the hardest problems with moving to this externalized authorization approach is around how you sort of get the performance that you're used to if it was hard coded into it. And having some external service or application that you have to call to is going to have some sort of performance hit. From an architectural perspective, what you want is to have those decisions happen as close to the application as possible in order to get that sort of sub-millisecond response time, which is really what is required for authorization. Because unlike authentication, which can happen once and you get a token valid for, say, 30 minutes, authorization has to be done in every single check or API call or request to your application, because it's not something you can cache because it's very contextual based on the request. So from an architectural perspective, externalizing authorization, but in a way that's centrally managed but distributed for its decisions, gives you kind of the best of both worlds. That central management piece is where you have a single source of the truth. That's one place where you update and manage and version and test your policies. And then you push what's called a policy decision point right next to the application services. Not to get too technical, but if you're running like Kubernetes, the sidecar pattern might be ringing a few bells into your head right now, where you literally have, for every instance of your application service, you have a decision point sitting right next to it. But those decision points are connected to that central store. So there's still a single point to update your policies, but then those policy changes are pushed out to all those connected instances. And so that way you do get the best of both worlds of centralized administration, but local decisioning.
And this is going to be the same. It doesn't have to be necessarily Kubernetes, right? If you're pushing out stacks that you're composing, for example, using Terraform, they're just being pushed out to the cloud as application units. Same model. That's going to spin off into a service, a VM, some sort of container somewhere, right? And if that one particular VM fails or that one particular API stops responding or whatever, it's fine because you're just going to wipe that out and push out the stack again anyway. It's not that there really is a single point of failure or a single point of vulnerability, because each of those application stacks is relying on its own deployed unit.
Exactly. You have a bit of a sense of shared fate between your application service and your decision point there. It's kind of a one-to-one relationship if you go for that model, and essentially makes authorization like a local API call, and it is just an API to your application. So with this architecture in mind, what impact does that have if we go back again and look at those people, process, technology points? So from a people point of perspective, defining requirements. So before we have that long list of sources of requirements, by extracting out and standardizing authorization to this external point, you now have the centralized place where your policies can be defined. And defining those policies is no longer application code. It can now be something that's much more close to human language as possible. So when you're actually brainstorming and working with your teams and your departments around what the authorization logic should be, you're already going to be talking in sentences. You're not going to be talking application code. Oh, the manager of this team should only be able to edit this type of resource. Taking that business logic and converting it to policy is something that can now be a bit of a shared ownership as part of like maybe a central group or central team, center of excellence type model that helps define and manage those policies. But the key thing here is it's no longer necessarily a task of an engineer only. It can be something that can be managed across different planes of departments and managed centrally. So we work with Nook, who's a fintech here in the UK, and they've actually managed to increase the number of different roles, groups, and tenants they have by a couple of orders of magnitude in some cases, and onboard new customers that they wouldn't have known before without their permissioning model. And a lot of that comes down to the fact that they have this permissioning model that all parts of the business can be involved with. And actually, because the policies are now something that's a bit more human readable than application code, actually helping them align both internal teams and in some cases external customers around what permissions they have or can't have, or why some access wasn't denied, etc. And really externalized authorization and taking a policy-based approach takes that workload out of the engineering team and actually starts putting it into the hands of the people that really own and define and evolve the authorization requirements in something that's far more readable and manageable and centrally managed and then distributed out for the actual implementation into the application.
The value of being able to reason about a problem can't be overstated.
Yeah, being able to just scan a document and actually understand what's going on without having to become a subject matter expert in some XYZ esoteric language. Trust me, we see some serious esoteric languages in across our users in a good way though, because they're cool, keeping them alive. But getting really the business side of things on side to really understand what's going on inside the system. So from a process perspective, so we talked about policy authoring, testing, rollout, auditing, etc. Now, policy authoring is slightly changed. So we're now no longer writing application code. We're now writing those human-ish policies. And in the case of Cerbos, these are YAML files. Love it, I hate it. YAML's here to stay. But there's something, you're not writing if-else statements. You're actually defining your actions in a way that's very structured and easy to ask and grasp and understand. And then what that now means from an authoring perspective is you now can follow all the best practices which traditionally have been stuck in developer world. So branches, tags, commits, those sort of things, software development lifecycle processes, but actually bring them more to like the business side of things. So policy is ultimately now just like another static asset, another version thing that can exist and follow your existing management and change processes. And from a testing perspective, the tooling that we make available with part of the Cerbos open source project is not only can you define your policy, but you can also write tests against that policy. And testing authorization typically is a bit of a nightmare when it's hard coded into your application. You now have to like simulate requests into your app through the different user roles and different contexts and sort of bend over backwards to get certain edge cases implemented. Because your authorization logic is now decoupled out and externalized in something that's versionable, that's actually testable in isolation. So as well as defining your policy and your authorization logic, you can also alongside it define, okay, here's some example users, here's some example resources, here are the actions that should be allowed or denied. And then have that part of your testing process. Whenever there's a policy change, you can kick off a test run and that'll tell you, yes, this now works or this has broken some sort of things. And that's coupled very nicely with the versioning of rollout. And CI/CD as a concept was very much stuck in developer world up to now, but really you can bring that to the business process as well with the tooling that you can get and the approach you get through externalized auth. And the order log story kind of mentioned before, because you now externalized authorization to a standalone piece, that service can then create that consistent audit log without fail. You will get a log line that says, at this time, this principal tries to do this action on this resource, is allowed or denied by this particular policy for this particular reason, which helps your devs understand what's going on, but also massively helps from a compliance regulatory security team point of view. You know, we work with a lot of IM architects and have security team folks kind of join calls with our users as well. And we sort of see their eyes light up when for the first time they can really understand maybe there's been some sort of investigation going on and what happened. They can actually just get this dump from Cerbos that says, okay, this happened, allowed tonight, job done. And you know, really helps people sleep at night. As you can see, Chuck, who works for on Sales Room, is one of our customers as well, allows them to get a bit more of a restful night knowing they actually have these strong controls in place and also have an audit log of exactly what happened. And then finally, to kind of wrap it up, you know, we've touched a lot on the technology from the architecture perspective, but when it comes to authorization, when you decouple it and you externalize it, you really no longer have to make a decision about where to run the authorization. It can run everywhere because it is just another service. It's just an API that is available inside of the infrastructure to check permissions. And each application service doesn't need to implement it itself and doesn't need that spaghetti code hard-coded in it. The deployability and scalability side of things, and we touched upon the centralized management and distributed decisions using whatever architecture makes sense for you. So Kubernetes sidecars, if you're in that world, but deploying a stack, pushing Docker composers over here somewhere, if you're running on-prem, air-gapped, etc., this model still works. You just run the decision points as close to the place that needs to make a decision as possible and connect up to that central store to get its feed of what the policies are. So once they're updated over here, that's pushed out across your entire architecture. And then for the integration and state management piece, you already have your single source of truth for your users and their roles, their teams in your identity provider. So whether you're using Cognito, Okta, Auth0, Azure Entra, Microsoft Entra, sorry, directory, LDAP, you name it, that is your source of truth. There shouldn't be any requirement to copy that over to some other system. You know, your externalized authorization layer should be able to take whatever context is available in the request of which the user's identity and team groups and make decisions based upon that without you from an architectural perspective having to worry about synchronizing state about the different resources and objects and such into the authorization layer. The authorization layer allows you to be stateless with Cerbos and make decisions based on the latest data as available at request time without you having to worry about copying data and eventual consistency problems. And then finally, on the integration piece, because authorization is now just an API, anything that can make an API call inside of the stack can now fit into that centralized authorization approach, and making sure you have that consistent authorization across the application architecture. So we always get asked, where do I start with all this? I have that greenfield development, or I have a brownfield development, or there's something a bit in the middle where we're architecting. Like, where do I go? Where do I begin? Where do I sort of start taking the first chisel away of moving to this more externalized approach? And really, it boils down to a few different things. Firstly, we've talked a lot about defining your business requirements, and this really is where to start. We do free workshops. Anyone can go sign up now, Cerbos.dev, where you get to speak to one of our team around your authorization requirements. And the biggest takeaway we after kind of explaining the approach to users is like, just go away, get the relevant people from your team in the room across those different departments, get that spreadsheet out and say, okay, here are my roles, here are my resources, here are my actions, and start doing the tick cross workshop to understand what permissions will be. And a lot, what you'll find very quickly is it's not usually a binary allow or deny. There's usually conditions attached with it. So yes, this person should be allowed, but only if they're part of the organization or the resource they're trying to access as part of the company they're associated with. And start defining what those business requirements are and those authorization logic are in natural language. Write down in English or French or whatever's relevant for you. Klingon if you want. And really get on the same page, not just from a technology team point of view, but also from those other departments that are relevant to authorizations of the business, and have those rules written down, just in plain up human readable language. Get that done, and then that's 90% of the work done in terms of implementing authorization. From a data perspective, so a lot of businesses and a lot of companies spend a lot of time like making sure that their data is in good shape. So your IDP should be your source of truth of who your identities are. Your backend database should be the source of truth for your different resources, etc. And all the work and the good practice and governance that you've put in place around making sure your data sources are clean and up to date and refreshed and a version as such is all completely applicable to authorization, because your authorization checks is only going to be as good as the data you give it to make a decision upon. So all the work you're doing probably already in terms of getting your data stack in place and making sure your data feeds are in the right place and things are up to date and accessible, etc. Keep doing that. That's the foundation you need to get solid authorization. So do not stop that. And if you're still working towards it, get that in place and then go on to authorization, and making sure you're having those good governance processes in place around identity and access controls is a key one. And then it makes doing the actual externalized authorization implementation much, much simpler. And then finally, just more of a mindset point of thing, which is architect around the use cases, not the technology. We talked about how now this approach is really an enabler for the business. So stop thinking about what can the tech do, start thinking about, okay, what are the access patterns we want to give to our internal teams or our end customers to surprise and delight in terms of how their permissions are managed and controlled. And then take a sort of an incremental adoption approach. With Cerbos, the way we work is resource by resource. So start off with maybe you're building like a payment system, start off with like the purchase orders resource. Start with that, get that externalized authorization logic set up, and then start growing and expanding, because that helps you get the rhythm and the business aligned with what the process needs to be. And then you can very rapidly start adding in and growing beyond that. And then finally, just one last call out. This is a very active space right now. We've at Cerbos been doing this for 3.5 years now. Been working on these problems for over a decade. And what's been really good to see in the last year, the OpenID Foundation has created the AuthZen working group, of which Cerbos is one of the initial members of. And we are a standards committee that we're putting together a draft specification around what the interface for the technical level authorization should be. So you might be familiar with things like OpenID Connect or OAuth for authentication. The AuthZen working group is working on a standard to do the same, but for authorization. So what is the interface for plugging in authorization solutions, with the idea of being one day the big application platforms in the world, much like they allow you to plug in your own identity provider with things like OAuth and OpenID Connect, you'll be able to plug in your own authorization logic as well. So if you're at all interested in like standards and how these come about, I really encourage you to come along either as someone implementer or even just come along with your business use cases, because we could definitely use a lot more of those. to make sure that we are building the best standard for it. And Cerbos is one of the first implementers of the working draft of that. And we'll be very actively involved in kind of making sure that comes to fruition because it is a benefit for the whole industry and basically software as a whole to get that in a good place.
So, Alex, where can I go for more information? I'd like to subscribe to your newsletter.
Absolutely. So the best place to find everything is cerbos.dev is our website. You can also book a workshop directly. Click the Speak Engineer button and sign up for a workshop. And then if you want much more of an interactive dialogue with Dan and I and the rest of the team, highly recommend you join our Slack community where we all hang out and answer all sorts of gnarly questions when it comes to authorization. And then finally on GitHub, you can find us at Cerbos, github.com/Cerbos.
Excellent. Do join us on the Cerbos community Slack. By the way, I would really like to talk to more people on the. I like Slack, so I'm lonely. Please come talk to me, and we'll get that community going. Really excited to hear, as I said, about your use cases. Right? What are you actually doing with authorization in the wild? This is what helps us to build a better product for you. This is what helps us to build a better open source project for you. So please don't be shy. Right?
Exactly.
Excellent. We have some great questions actually that are kicking around. We'll get to them in the pace that we can. So you were talking right at the end there about OAuth. You touched on OAuth, and we've touched on OIC.
Yes.
And so there's a question here from Arun Kumar. Can you talk about how this is different / better than using OAuth scopes and tokens?
Great question. This is something that we get asked a lot. So OAuth tokens are generally issued at authentication time. And that's when it makes sense. You issue a token, and inside that, you start adding scopes. When you start looking at really what the authorization requirements are for an application, it requires a lot more context than the data you have at session start time or authentication time. Because if you want to start giving access or permissions based on the actual context of the resource that someone's accessing, so for example, only the owner of the team that this resource belongs to should have this permission. What you'll quickly end up doing if you try and do it with scopes is you're going to have these more and more specific scopes inside of your token, and you're actually going to start exceeding the limit of what the token size should be. And more importantly, scopes are basically permanent until you issue a new token or refresh that token. And so when your policies change, you're going to have to wait till the next authentication session to get that new token, and then start reacting based upon the scopes. OAuth 2 scopes are great for getting those high-level roles from your IDP. So this person is a user, this person is a manager, this person is a subscriber. But then that is used as an input to the authorization layer and down in the application where you do have the full context of the principal or the subject, the resource, and the action that's being done to make those really fine-grained contextual request time decisionings. So it's a bit of a hybrid of both, but externalized authorization is the approach which gives you the scalability and the workflow that makes it all manageable.
So it's not a one or other. It could be both, and it could be both in a variety of different ways.
Exactly. Always is.
Technology decisions.
Oh, yeah.
Excellent. Speaking of technology decisions, Ivan's got a question. Straight up, Ivan, I appreciate you getting right to the point. Why would I choose Cerbos rather than using a native cloud solution such as AWS AVP?
So when we started building our Cerbos, we wanted to make sure it's something a developer can use anywhere. And by anywhere, we don't just necessarily mean on their own dev machine, but also we see hybrid cloud, and this is only becoming a trend more and more. We have a lot of users that are also using air-gapped environments where using a cloud native provided API is just not an option. We even have some users that ship physical hardware out into the world with Cerbos running on them. So you need to be able to cater and run authorization anywhere across your stack. I was in a discussion a few weeks ago with a user who's kind of building this new world of AI models, training, etc. And they now need to push compute to wherever they can find GPUs. So they're picking infrastructure providers not based on the ones they prefer, but literally is they have 10 NVIDIA H100s available. I'm going to go and deploy my app there. But they needed the authorization in every location that they're running in. And we're seeing hybrid cloud becoming actually more and more of a reality, as well as coming off the cloud and back on-prem seems to be a bit of a trend, at least in my Twitter filter bubble. Spinning up VPSs left, right, and center and managing them yourself rather than paying one of the big hyperscalers. Being able to basically do authorization logic wherever you're running compute is a key for authorization, and having that centralized management but then distributed decisions. Having something like Cerbos enables you to do that regardless of where you are without being tied into one particular cloud environment or cloud provider.
I mean, hybrid cloud and multi-cloud and on-prem, off-prem, I mean,
Yeah.
these are real. These are not theoretical scenarios, and they're more likely than you think,
Oh,
to
yes.
be perfectly honest. And as you said, having the capacity to just manage your authorization in a standard way across all of that takes so much headache out of it. Like, let's not even talk about regulatory frameworks
Oh,
and
yeah.
audit trails. You know what I mean? Like, that's great, but just you as the practitioner having to manage this? Are you kidding me? Just
I know.
you know, like that's huge. It's a huge time savings, and sanity savings, frankly. So speaking again, we're talking about technology, right? Implementing technology. Ranganath Nadella asks, what's your recommendation for where to store user information related to authorization? In the IDP, which provides tokens, rich authorization requests, right? Or the authorization server, you know, where
Yeah.
the username is generated, stored, etc. Two-part question. Everyone loves a two-part question. Also, how should the access information itself be stored? Are we talking an in-memory database? Are we talking an external database? Are we talking a Unix socket to a text file somewhere? What are we talking about?
Yeah, so the first part, when we think about what's involved with authorization, there's really three parts. You have the identity piece, you have the directory piece, and then you have the actual authorization decisioning piece. And audit is kind of a side product of that. So for the identity piece, there are now a myriad of authentication providers or IDPs out there that you can use. No one builds their own authentication these days. Those days are solved thanks to things like OpenID Connect. So in terms of what we see a lot of, we see a lot of Okta Auth0, we see a lot of Cognito from AWS, we see Azure Active Directory and Entra ID involved in that. The directory piece with most of the time is coupled with the authentication side of things. So Okta has directory, Azure AD has directories, Cognito has user and groups roles. There's some of the newer players on the block. You look at the Clark solutions, you go and look at AuthKits as well. And there's always a concept of directory associated with that as well. And that's really your master store of who user is, what roles and teams and groups they have. That is a responsibility of the IDP and directory combination, and that's what should go inside of there. And then the authorization layer, using something like Cerbos, takes in that context out request times and makes a decision. Now, in terms of where you store the access information, if we're talking particularly about the access policies, in terms of Cerbos, we actually encourage users to look at storing them just as static files in a Git repo. That way, the processes you're used to today in terms of versioning, testing, branches, change requests, PRs, all that sort of stuff continues, but now for your authorization logic, which has massive benefits from both a process but also a governance perspective. And you don't need to involve a database or anything like that. There's less infrastructure you need to run. These are just static assets, static files, which you can pull into your decision points.
No, we're talking private repos here, right? You're not
Yes,
necessarily going to want to expose this to
absolutely.
the whole world, right? Another thing I like about what you're saying there is that we can also sort of start to treat it like code,
Yep.
right? Like it's not some esoteric object. It's not some weird, you know, XML compiled XML thing, you know, sitting off in Perforce,
Yeah.
right? This is it's YAML. We can
Yeah,
generate that, right? We can diff that.
absolutely.
Yeah. So we can store it basically anywhere. We can put it in a database. We can put it in a text file. We can pull it down. I guess what you're saying there is that it really that's an implementation detail,
Yes,
right?
and pick whatever best suits your architecture. If you're already heavy into like a very GitOps style workflow, go with those kind of static file side of things. If you're maybe migrating more of a database workflow, Cerbos also supports database backend. So really, it's kind of down to you to define what's best for your architecture. But from a business and policy definition process, it follows this decoupling or externalizing the authorization logic from the application code, where you store it is a decision based on your architecture.
Fantastic. All right. Well, hey, with that, that's the end of our questions. And it's also the end of our time. So thank you so much to everybody that joined us today. Thank you so much for your questions in particular. Really, really, really enjoyed those excellent questions. Very insightful. Really, really appreciate it. We will have more good stuff coming your way over the coming months. We've got some more webinars. We've got some interesting blog posts coming up. We're going to be at conferences. We're going to be all sorts of opportunities to meet us and chat with us. Please come sign up on the Cerbos community. Come hit us up anytime you see us at the meetups, at the conferences. Really, really happy to chat with you. And definitely download the open source package, kick the tires, sign up for Cerbos Hub, get a feel for what the control plane feels like, just so you get a better idea of what all of this means. We've talked about a lot of hypotheticals, and the only way really to get a strong, appreciation for it is to try it out for yourself. Try the playground out, right? Write some policies, see how it feels. I'm sure that you'll find it just as interesting as I did a few short weeks ago. All right. Thank you again, everybody. At the recording of this webinar, along with some other helpful links, will of course be sent to your email shortly. So if you'd like to review anything from here or ask some more questions, that'll be another way to do it too. On that note, thank you again, everybody, and we will see you next time.
Thanks, all.